The cabin went quiet, not because someone spoke, but because someone decided she didn't belong. A black woman stepped into the premier cabin, calm and unassuming. No argument, no mistake, just a look, and a choice made on her behalf. They didn't call themselves powerful. People like Brandon Cole never do. Brandon was a gate agent, mid-level, clipboard authority, the kind of role that comes with a uniform, a radio, and just enough discretion to decide who slows down the line and who gets waved through. He didn't think of it as judgment. He thought of it as maintaining standards. When Nadia approached, Brandon didn't raise his voice. He didn't block her outright. He just paused. Let his eyes linger half a second too long. Checked the screen again, even though nothing had changed. Then he tilted his head and said, calm as policy, that the premier cabin boarding would take a moment. That moment stretched. He'd already seen her ticket. He knew it was valid. But there was something about her that didn't match the mental picture he carried of who usually sat up front. And in that gap, between what the system confirmed and what he personally believed, Brandon made a choice. Not a loud one, a quiet one. A few steps inside the aircraft, Elaine Hart took over. Elaine was the purser. Senior crew. Perfect posture. Voice trained to sound pleasant even when delivering bad news. She didn't see herself as biased. She saw herself as the person who kept order when things got unclear. Elaine glanced at Nadia's seat assignment. Premier cabin, first row. She looked again, slower this time. Then she smiled. But it was the kind of smile that draws a line. There may have been a mix-up, she said, softly. Public enough to be heard. Polite enough to sound reasonable. No insults, no slurs. Nothing you could quote later. Just implication. Elaine believed in rules, or at least in her version of them. Rules that bent quietly around people who looked familiar. Rules that hardened around people who didn't. To her, discretion wasn't power. It was responsibility. And responsibility, she believed, gave her the right to interpret. What neither Brandon nor Elaine ever said, what they never needed to say, was the same thing. You don't look like someone we expect here. That's how systems really work. Not through confrontation, but through friction. Small delays, slight doubts. Extra questions asked of some people and not others. No single moment outrageous enough to report. Yet just enough resistance to remind you that access is conditional. And here's the part most people misunderstand about power. Real power doesn't announce itself. It observes. People assume that if someone truly holds authority, they'll use it immediately. They'll object, escalate, demand a supervisor, make noise. But in large organizations, the people who last the longest are often the ones who say the least at the beginning. Because they're not reacting, they're collecting. Every glance, every deviation from procedure, every choice that can't later be explained as a mistake. Brandon thought he was being careful. Elaine thought she was being professional. Neither of them realized they were leaving a trail. Not of words, but of decisions. Decisions made when they thought no one important was watching. That's the danger of gatekeepers. Not that they hold too much power, but that they forget how visible their choices become over time. Elaine didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She simply adjusted the service flow, made sure Nadia's requests were answered last, explained delays as operational, framed exclusions as temporary, each action defensible on its own. Together, unmistakable. This is how people convince themselves they're doing nothing wrong. They zoom in so tightly on the moment that they never have to see the pattern. But patterns are what systems respond to. And while Elaine was busy managing the cabin, and Brandon returned to his gate believing the situation was handled, something else was happening quietly in the background. Not retaliation, not confrontation, documentation. Because power, when it's real, doesn't rush. It waits until the other side feels safe enough to keep going. By the time the cabin door closed and the seatbelt sign chimed on, Brandon had already moved on to the next passenger. Elaine had already justified her decisions in her head, and Nadia hadn't said a word. To them, that silence meant compliance. They didn't realize it meant something else entirely. 20 minutes into the flight, the cabin settled into its rhythm. The seatbelt sign dimmed. Engines leveled out. The soft choreography of service began. Carts rolled, curtains shifted, glassware clinked, except at one seat. Nadia Cross remained still. When the first drink order was taken, she asked for sparkling water. Nothing complicated, no urgency. The attendant nodded and moved on. 2 minutes passed, then 5. The cart returned. Glasses of cut crystal were placed gently onto white linen trays. At Nadia's seat, the attendant stopped, hesitated, then reached beneath the cart and placed a paper cup on the armrest instead. No explanation, no eye contact. Just a paper cup, slightly dented, sweating onto the polished wood. Nadia didn't say anything. Across the aisle, someone noticed, then looked away. This is how it starts. Not with confrontation, but with substitution. The downgrade that pretends to be neutral. The kind that can always be explained later as an oversight. Elaine Hart noticed the moment, too. She always did. She watched from the galley as the paper cup landed. She didn't intervene. She didn't correct it. She turned back to her tablet and continued scrolling. In her mind, this wasn't exclusion. It was discretion. 10 minutes later, meal service began. Premier cabin menus were placed down like contracts, folded precisely, names spoken softly, preferences remembered. Nadia waited. When her turn came, the server glanced at the list again, then again, as if searching for permission that wasn't written anywhere. "We're experiencing a slight delay for this seat," the attendant said. Polite, calm, practiced. A delay implies resolution. None came. The trays were served, cutlery aligned. The smell of warm bread drifted through the cabin. Nadia's table remained empty. She didn't ask. She didn't look around. She adjusted her sleeve, rested her hands on her lap. That stillness was unsettling. People expect resistance, even polite resistance. A raised eyebrow, a cleared throat, something to react to. But Nadia offered nothing, and without resistance, the behavior escalated. Requests answered last, questions redirected. Each interaction stripped of urgency, not denied, deferred. This is the version of injustice that survives audits, the kind that leaves no single moment outrageous enough to flag, just enough friction to send a message. Elaine told herself she was maintaining flow. Brandon, back at the gate, would have called it keeping things smooth. Smooth for whom was never asked. Half an hour in, the man across from Nadia finished his drink. Crystal glass, perfectly chilled. The attendant reached to clear it, smiling. When Nadia's paper cup was empty, it sat there, ignored. She didn't wave, didn't stack it, didn't push it forward to be noticed. She waited, and that waiting changed the tone of the room. Because silence, when it stretches too long, becomes its own kind of pressure. People began to notice the pattern. Not because anyone said anything, but because nothing changed. The same seat, the same delays, the same omissions. Elaine noticed too, and instead of correcting it, she leaned into it. This is what happens when people believe their authority is unquestioned. They stop hiding their preferences, they stop pretending neutrality, they test boundaries. Elaine adjusted the service sequence again. Nadia's seat slipped lower on the priority list. Not formally, informally, the most deniable way. She told herself it wasn't personal, it was about maintaining order. But order in systems like this is often code for familiarity. What felt dangerous to Elaine wasn't that Nadia might complain, it was that she didn't. Silence can be interpreted many ways. Weakness is the most common mistake. Elaine assumed compliance. She assumed resignation. She assumed that if Nadia truly belonged there, she would say something. She didn't consider another possibility, that some people don't speak because they're not done listening. 40 minutes in, the cabin was calm again. The initial discomfort faded into routine. People returned to their screens. Headphones went on. Conversation softened. The system had absorbed the anomaly. And that's when the real damage happens. Because when injustice becomes routine, it stops feeling like a violation and starts feeling like policy. Elaine felt comfortable now. Confident. The worst had passed. No scene, no escalation, no disruption. She had managed it. What she didn't realize was that every small choice, every delay, every substitution, every omission was doing something else entirely. It was documenting itself. Nadia's silence wasn't absence, it was accumulation. She registered the paper cup, the missing tray, the unanswered request. She noted who acted, who looked away, who chose convenience over correction. She didn't react because reacting would have ended the process too early. This wasn't about being served last, it was about letting the pattern finish forming. And in that quiet cabin, at cruising altitude, while everyone believed the situation had stabilized, something irreversible was taking shape. Not a confrontation, a record. By the time the cabin lights dimmed and the service carts were locked back into place, Elaine felt certain the situation was behind her. Nadia hadn't said a word. To Elaine, that meant victory. She didn't realize it meant exposure, because injustice doesn't need shouting to grow. Sometimes all it needs is time. The shift happened quietly, not from the crew, from a passenger. Arthur Bell had been watching the situation longer than anyone realized. He sat comfortably in his seat, jacket folded, watch face catching the cabin light every time he moved his wrist. He belonged here. Everyone could tell. He had that effortless confidence that never needed to announce itself. When service reached him, it was flawless. Crystal glass. Immediate response. A brief exchange about vintage and temperature. Arthur noticed the contrast. He noticed the paper cup, the empty tray, the way Nadia was treated like a logistical inconvenience instead of a guest. And that contrast bothered him, not because it was unfair, but because it disrupted his sense of order. He leaned slightly toward the aisle and cleared his throat. "I think there's been a mistake," he said, voice calm, authoritative, the kind people listen to. Elaine turned immediately. "Yes, sir?" Arthur gestured casually toward Nadia's seat. "My cufflink was just here. I took it off during the meal. I can't seem to find it." The word hung there. Lost. Elaine's posture changed, not visibly, subtly. A missing object in Premier Cabin wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat. To perception, to status, to control. Her eyes moved to Nadia. Not because of evidence, because of proximity. Because she had already been marked as different. Arthur didn't accuse her directly. He didn't need to. He simply added, "She was the last person near my seat." It wasn't a claim, right? It was a suggestion. And suggestions are easier to act on than accusations. Elaine nodded once. Professional, measured. "I'll take care of it." She stepped into the galley and reached for the intercom, not to make an announcement, but to call security discreetly. A protocol most passengers never see. Within moments, the tone of the cabin shifted. Voices lowered, movement slowed. The word security has a way of reframing reality. What had been poor service became a potential incident. What had been discomfort became risk. Elaine approached Nadia's seat with two crew members. "Ma'am," she said evenly, "we're missing an item. We'll need to conduct a brief check." Nadia looked up. This was the first time she met Elaine's eyes. No panic, no outrage, just attention. "What kind of check?" she asked. Her voice was steady. Controlled. Almost curious. Elaine hesitated for half a second. "Your personal belongings," she replied, "just to clear things up." Clear for whom was not stated. The aisle felt narrower now. Other passengers pretended not to watch. Screens suddenly became very interesting. Headphones went back on. No one objected. No one intervened. Because this was what order looks like when it wears a uniform. This is the moment when the story hardens, when a situation stops being social and becomes procedural. Arthur leaned back, arms crossed, calm, certain. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply spoken. Security arrived, not aggressive, not rushed, calm men with practiced expressions. They didn't look at Arthur, they didn't look at Elaine, they looked at Nadia. One of them explained the process, routine, standard, just a precaution. The language was smooth, sanitized. Nadia listened, and then she asked a question that landed heavier than any accusation. "If I weren't sitting here," she said, "would this still be happening?" No one answered. Because the answer was obvious. If she weren't here, if she were invisible, compliant, poor in appearance, there would be no concern about missing cufflinks. If she weren't here, nothing would need to be cleared up. This is where most stories end. This is where the powerless are escorted off, where notes are added to records, where reputations quietly fracture. No video, no apology, no consequences, just removal. That's what makes this moment feel final. The system had chosen its side. Security asked Nadia to stand. She did. Slowly, deliberately. She didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't raise her voice. No, and that calm unsettled the room. Because panic would have justified everything. Calm made it uncomfortable. As one of the officers reached toward her bag, Nadia spoke again. "Before you proceed," she said, "I'd like to understand the basis for this." Elaine stiffened. Arthur frowned slightly. "Sir reported a missing item," Elaine said. "And protocol requires—" "Protocol," Nadia repeated. "Or assumption." The word cut clean. Elaine bristled. "Ma'am, please cooperate." Cooperate is the word systems use when they want compliance without consent. The officer paused, hand hovering. Arthur shifted in his seat. The tension had crossed a line. This was no longer about a cufflink. It was about authority being questioned. And authority does not like to be questioned. Elaine nodded once to security. "Proceed." This was the point of no return. To the cabin, it looked like justice being enforced. To Nadia, it looked like the inevitable result of everything that had come before. The paper cup, the missing tray, the silence. This was where it all led. And if Nadia were anyone else, if she had no access, no leverage, no unseen reach, this would be the end of her story. She would be escorted off, labeled difficult, forgotten. But instead of resisting, Nadia did something unexpected. She smiled. Not defiant, not amused, informed. She reached into her jacket and removed a small, unassuming card. No logo, no branding. She handed it to the officer. "Before you search," she said calmly, "please scan that." The officer hesitated, then did. The device chirped once, then again. His expression changed. Elaine watched. Arthur leaned forward. The cabin held its breath. Because whatever was about to happen next was no longer about security. It was about who had just made the wrong call, and whether the system was ready to admit it. The chirp was soft, almost polite. The officer glanced down at his device, then back at the card in his hand. He scanned it again, slower this time, as if expecting the result to change. It didn't. His posture shifted, not alarmed, not aggressive, careful. "Ma'am," he said, lowering his voice, "please remain seated for a moment." Elaine noticed the change immediately. "What's the issue?" she asked, stepping closer. Her tone was still professional, but the certainty was gone. The officer didn't answer her. He turned slightly away and spoke into his radio. Quietly, using words that didn't belong in routine checks. Arthur Bell straightened in his seat. "This is getting unnecessary," he said. "I just want my property located." The officer finally looked at him. "Yes, sir," he replied. "We're clarifying something first." Clarifying, not searching. That distinction landed. Elaine felt it before she understood it. The atmosphere had shifted, but not in the way she expected. This wasn't escalation anymore, it was hesitation. Nadia sat back down, hands resting calmly on the armrests. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't demanded anything. She had simply introduced the system into the conversation. Within seconds, a message moved upstream, not to the cockpit, not to the cabin crew, to compliance. Level red access doesn't announce itself, it doesn't flash. It doesn't come with a warning tone, it just opens doors that were previously locked. Somewhere far from the cabin, screens populated with data. Service logs, crew notes, timestamps, small decisions stacked on top of each other. Paper cup, delayed meal, unanswered call button, security request. Each one insignificant alone. Together, unmistakable. Back in the cabin, Elaine's tablet vibrated. Once. She glanced down instinctively, then froze. The screen wasn't showing her service flow anymore. It had switched to a restricted interface. one she hadn't seen before. She tried to swipe back. It didn't respond. "What's going on?" she asked, this time louder. The officer turned toward her. Respectful, neutral. "Ma'am, we've been instructed to pause all actions involving this passenger." Instructed. By whom was not said. Arthur's confidence wavered. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're disrupting the cabin over a missing cufflink." The officer nodded. "We're no longer investigating a missing item, sir." Arthur frowned. "Then what are you investigating?" The officer hesitated just long enough to be deliberate. "A procedural concern." Elaine's throat tightened. Procedural was the word compliance used when behavior, not outcomes, was under review. The cabin had gone quiet. Not dramatic silence. Observant silence. People sensed something had changed, even if they didn't know what. Elaine stepped back toward the galley, fingers tightening around her tablet. Another vibration. This time a message appeared. "Service actions under review. Do not engage." She stared at the screen, and her authority, so carefully exercised minutes earlier, had just been suspended. No announcement, no confrontation, just removed. The officer turned back to Nadia. "Ma'am, thank you for your patience," he said. "We're going to need a few moments." Nadia nodded. That was it. No speech, no reveal, no satisfaction, just confirmation. Arthur leaned forward, voice sharper now. "I expect this to be resolved immediately." The officer met his gaze, calm, firm. "It is being resolved, sir, just not the way you anticipated." Arthur opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time since he spoke up, no one moved to accommodate him. Elaine watched this unfold with growing unease. She realized too late what had happened. She hadn't been challenged. She had been documented. Every choice she thought was invisible had been logged. Every assumption she believed was reasonable had been recorded without commentary. This wasn't retaliation. It was audit, the most dangerous thing in any system. Because audits don't care how you felt. They care what you did. Another message appeared on Elaine's screen. Previous incidents detected. Cross-referencing in progress. Her pulse quickened. Previous incidents? She thought of other flights, other passengers, other moments she'd smoothed over, reframed, justified. She had always been careful, always subtle. She had never imagined subtlety could be tracked. Arthur shifted again, irritation creeping into his voice. "Am I being accused of something?" "No, sir," the officer replied. "You're being asked to wait." Wait. The word landed differently when it was applied upward. Nadia remained silent. Not because she had nothing to say, because everything that needed to be said was already speaking for her. The cabin crew stood still now, uncertain who was in charge. Elaine's authority had evaporated, but no one had replaced it yet. That vacuum was louder than any confrontation. The plane continued forward, steady, unaware. The engines didn't change pitch, the route didn't alter. From the outside, nothing had happened. Inside, everything had. Because the moment the system begins asking questions, the outcome is no longer controlled by personalities. It's controlled by patterns. And patterns don't take sides. They just reveal them. Elaine looked once more at Nadia. This time there was no judgment in her eyes, only calculation. She was trying to understand when she'd lost control. The answer was simple. She lost it the moment she believed no one important was watching. And as the cabin waited, suspended between authority and accountability, one truth settled in quietly. The power had already shifted. No announcement required, no identity revealed. Just a system finally doing what it was designed to do. Observe, record, and decide. The shift didn't come with a sound, no announcement, no raised voice, just data opening where silence used to live. Elaine stood frozen near the galley, eyes fixed on her tablet as new fields populated the screen. Timestamps, route numbers, crew IDs. Then a heading she hadn't expected. Prior service flags. Her thumb hovered, then tapped. The first entry appeared. 3 months ago, red-eye route, Premier Cabin. A passenger complaint. Dismissive tone. Unequal service. Internal note, coaching recommended. No formal action taken. Elaine swallowed. Another entry loaded beneath it. 6 weeks later, international leg, similar language, different passenger. Internal note, context unclear, no escalation required. 2 warnings, both closed, both buried. Elaine felt the cabin narrow around her. Not physically, structurally, like a hallway with doors slowly shutting. She scrolled. There were patterns now. The system wasn't asking if she'd done something wrong. It was asking how often. Back in the cabin, the officer received an update through his earpiece. He didn't react outwardly, he just adjusted his stance. Feet slightly wider, shoulders squared. The kind of posture you take when you know the situation has moved beyond debate. Arthur Bell sensed it too. "This is absurd," he said again, but the edge had softened. "I want to speak to whoever authorized this." The officer nodded once. "That request has been logged." Logged, not answered. Arthur exhaled sharply, glancing around as if looking for support. He found none. The crew wasn't rallying, passengers weren't staring. Everyone was waiting. Because once systems start pulling records, opinions stop mattering. Elaine took a step back, almost stumbling into the galley counter. She had always believed she was careful, that she knew where the lines were, that she operated within discretion. But the data didn't show discretion, it showed repetition. And repetition turns behavior into policy. Another notification appeared on her screen. Cross-reference complete. She tapped it without thinking. A heat map bloomed across the display. Routes, seats, cabin sections. Premier cabin lit up brighter than the rest. Her chest tightened. This wasn't about Nadia anymore. This was about everyone who had come before her. Every small decision that felt justified in the moment. Every glance that lingered too long. Every service choice framed as standard procedure. Together they formed a pattern no explanation could undo. Elaine looked up and met Nadia's eyes. For the first time, she didn't see defiance. She saw distance. Nadia wasn't watching her. She was watching the system do its work. Somewhere beyond the cabin, compliance pulled the thread further. They didn't need intent. They didn't need motive. They had logs. They had timestamps. They had outcomes. And outcomes don't argue back. Arthur shifted again, clearing his throat. "If there's an issue with the crew, that's not my concern. I made a report." The officer turned toward him, expression unchanged. "Yes, sir. And your report is part of the record." Arthur frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," the officer said evenly, "that all actions taken after your report are being reviewed as well." Arthur blinked. "My actions?" "You initiated a security escalation without evidence," the officer replied. "That's also documented." Arthur leaned back, color draining from his face. He hadn't considered that. Elaine's tablet vibrated again. This time, a message marked priority. Preliminary finding, pattern of discretionary bias, recommendation pending. Bias. The word wasn't emotional, it wasn't accusatory, it was administrative, which made it lethal. Elaine felt her authority collapse inward, not with a bang but with a quiet certainty. She hadn't been singled out. She had been measured, and measured behavior has nowhere to hide. Nadia remained seated, hands folded loosely. She hadn't asked for this review. She hadn't demanded an investigation. She had simply allowed the situation to continue long enough for it to reveal itself. The officer received one final update. He nodded once, then addressed the cabin crew. "All non-essential service is suspended until further notice." Elaine stared at him. Suspended. Her. Without a word spoken directly to her. That was when it became clear. This wasn't about punishing a person. It was about correcting a system that had learned the wrong lessons. The question in the cabin shifted. It was no longer, "Oh wait, did Elaine go too far?" It became, how many times did this happen before no one intervened? How many passengers swallowed the moment? How many crew members looked away? How many reports were softened, reframed, or dismissed? Because systems don't fail loudly. They fail by normalizing harm. Arthur sat still now, hands clasped, eyes down. The confidence that had carried him minutes earlier was gone. He wasn't being accused, he was being included in a process he no longer controlled. Elaine closed her eyes briefly. She remembered those earlier flights, the certainty she'd felt, the ease with which she'd assumed she was right. She had never imagined that the absence of consequence was temporary, but the system had been watching, quietly, patiently. And now it had enough. The cabin remained calm. The plane continued on its path. No course correction, no emergency, just a recalibration. Because the real twist wasn't that one person had crossed a line. It was that the line had been crossed before, and no one stopped it. Until now. Lily Moore hadn't moved. She stood a few steps behind Elaine, hands folded at her waist, eyes lowered just enough to avoid attention. She had been there the whole time, during the comments, during the delay, during the escalation. She saw everything. She said nothing. No one had asked her to speak. No one had ordered her to stay quiet. She simply did what she had learned to do. Blend in. Don't interrupt. Don't challenge authority in public. When the officer paused service and compliance took over, Lily felt a flicker of relief. Not because things were being fixed, but because she no longer had to decide. Decisions are heavy when you're low on the ladder. The cabin waited. Quiet. Still. Elaine's authority was gone now, but the question lingered in the air, unspoken. What about the people who watched? The system didn't miss Lily. A note appeared on a secondary screen. Crew proximity, witness presence, response logs. Lily's name surfaced, not highlighted, not flagged, just listed. Because silence leaves a trace too. The officer glanced toward her, then back to his device. "Miss Moore," he said calmly, "were you present during the initial service refusal?" Lily looked up. "Yes." "Did you hear the exchange?" "Yes." "Did you intervene?" The question wasn't aggressive. It didn't accuse. It just waited. Lily hesitated. "No," she said. "One word, enough." Elaine turned slowly, her eyes narrowing, not in anger but in disbelief. Lily avoided her gaze. The officer nodded, typing something in. No commentary, no judgment, just documentation. Lily felt her stomach tighten. She wanted to explain. She wanted to say she was new, that Elaine was her supervisor, that speaking up would have consequences. All of that was true, and none of it changed the record, because the system wasn't asking why she stayed silent. It was asking whether she did. The cabin felt heavier now, not because someone was being punished, but because responsibility had widened. This wasn't just about power, it was about proximity. Lily wasn't the one who denied service. She wasn't the one who escalated. She wasn't the one who called security, but she was there. And being there is never neutral. The officer finished his note and looked at her again. "Thank you," he said. That was it. No reprimand, no absolution. Just acknowledgement. Lily exhaled slowly, realizing her silence had been weighed, not excused. And for the first time, she wondered which was worse. Nadia watched the exchange without expression. She didn't look at Lily with anger. She didn't look at her with forgiveness either. She simply looked away. Because this wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a moment for clarity. Silence doesn't scream, it doesn't shove, it doesn't accuse. It just steps aside and lets things happen. And when systems review harm, silence is never invisible, it's contextual. Lily stood there, heart racing, thinking of every moment she'd convinced herself that staying quiet was the safest choice. It had felt like survival. But survival for whom? The system didn't label her a villain. It didn't label her a victim. It left the question open. And that question lingered longer than any accusation could. If you see something wrong and say nothing, who benefits? If you keep your job but lose your voice, what did you trade? Lily looked down at her hands. They were steady. That surprised her. She had expected shame or fear. Instead, she felt something closer to discomfort. The kind that doesn't go away quickly. The kind that asks you to choose differently next time. Elaine looked away from Lily, jaw tight. She understood the implication immediately. The system wasn't just dismantling authority, it was mapping complicity, not to punish it, to expose it. Because organizations don't collapse from one bad actor. They persist because of many quiet ones. The officer turned back to the cabin. "We'll be continuing our review," he said evenly. And just like that, Lily was no longer invisible. Not singled out, but seen. That was the hardest part. Because being seen means you can't pretend you weren't there. The question followed her silently. To the galley, to future flights, to every moment where a line is crossed slowly enough to step over without noticing. Was she a victim of the system? Or a participant in it? No one answered for her. The system wouldn't. It never does. It just records what you choose when it matters, and leaves you to live with it. Because silence isn't loud, but it's never empty. And it always stands somewhere. The only question is where. Bias doesn't usually arrive as a headline, it shows up as a habit. A preference. A shortcut someone tells themselves is harmless. Elaine didn't wake up that morning planning to ruin her career. She didn't make a speech. She didn't post anything reckless online. She followed patterns she had repeated long enough to stop questioning. That's how most careers end now. Not with explosions, with receipts. There's a difference the system cares deeply about. A mistake is accidental. Bias is a choice repeated until it feels like policy. Elaine's defenders would later say the same things people always say. She was under pressure. She misread the situation. She didn't mean it that way. None of that mattered, because intent isn't what closes doors. Behavior does. A spilled drink is a mistake. Replacing a glass once is an error. Replacing it twice only for one kind of passenger is a decision. Delaying service can be procedural. Delaying it selectively becomes discrimination. No one was punishing Elaine for being imperfect. They were responding to a pattern she had full control over. That's the line most people miss. Power isn't about volume, it's about discretion. And discretion is where bias hides best. Elaine never used slurs. She never raised her voice. She enforced standards. Standards that somehow bent depending on who was standing in front of her. That's not an accident. That's calibration. The system didn't ask whether she hated anyone. It asked whether her choices created unequal outcomes. They did. That's enough. Careers today aren't destroyed by outrage. They're ended by audits, by compliance reviews, by quiet emails that say, "After careful consideration." Because organizations don't fear bad people, they fear liability. Bias creates risk. Risk gets removed. Arthur Bell learned this in a different way. He thought authority came from confidence, from sounding sure, from being the kind of person people believe without proof. For a while he was right, until the system asked for evidence. Calling security isn't illegal, but weaponizing it is. Escalating without cause isn't bold. It's reckless. And recklessness leaves a trail. Arthur didn't lose anything in that cabin. Not yet. But his certainty cracked. He realized something important too late. The same system that once worked in his favor was perfectly capable of turning neutral. And neutral systems don't protect ego. They protect records. Bias doesn't kill people most of the time. But it kills trust. And trust is what careers run on. Once it's gone, you don't get to explain your way back in. Elaine would eventually understand that she wasn't being judged as a person. She was being evaluated as a risk profile. Repeated flags, uncorrected behavior, witness corroboration. That's not a scandal. That's a spreadsheet. And spreadsheets don't care how long you've worked somewhere. They care how often the same problem shows up under your name. This is why people get confused watching stories like this. They ask, isn't this too harsh? Does one incident really justify this? But it was never one incident. It was the comfort of thinking no one was counting. Bias thrives where accountability feels optional. The moment accountability arrives, bias looks exactly like incompetence. That's the irony. Elaine didn't lose her standing because she was cruel. She lost it because she was consistent. Consistently wrong in the same direction. Organizations can forgive mistakes. They can't ensure patterns. That's the part worth sitting with. This isn't about morality, it's about math. Outcomes over time. Who gets delayed? Who gets doubted? Who gets escalated? When the numbers line up, explanations stop working. Lily learned something here too. Silence might protect you short term, but it doesn't make you invisible. It just delays the moment you're counted. Because modern systems don't just track actions, they track proximity. Who was present? Who had a chance to intervene? Who chose not to? Bias doesn't require villains, it only requires enough people deciding it's not their problem. That's how it survives. Not loudly, but efficiently. This is why careers end quietly now. No press release, no public shaming, just a door that doesn't open anymore. Elaine didn't lose everything because she said the wrong thing once. She lost it because she made the same choice repeatedly and called it professionalism. And professionalism without fairness is just power wearing a uniform. The lesson here isn't fear, it's clarity. Everyone makes mistakes, not everyone doubles down on them. Bias doesn't kill people most days, but it does something just as final. It ends futures, and it does it without raising its voice. There's a moment most viewers don't talk about out loud. The moment when things finally turn, when the power shifts, when the person who acted untouchable isn't anymore, and something inside you relaxes. Not joy, not cruelty, relief. It feels right. People call it satisfaction, but that's not precise enough. What you're feeling has a name: moral pleasure. It's not about punishment, it's about order. For most of the story, the imbalance is unbearable. Someone abuses discretion. Someone else absorbs it quietly, and nothing happens. That's the part that makes people restless. Not the injustice itself, the lack of consequence. When consequences finally arrive, the body responds before the mind does. Your shoulders drop. Your breathing slows. Because the world just made sense again, even briefly. That feeling doesn't come from watching someone fall. It comes from watching a rule reassert itself. Power wasn't absolute. Arrogance wasn't protected. Behavior mattered. Humans are wired for that. We need to believe that actions lead somewhere, that there's a ledger, not cosmic justice, just accounting. When Elaine's authority dissolved, viewers didn't cheer because she suffered. They exhaled because the imbalance closed. When Arthur's confidence cracked, it wasn't schadenfreude. It was correction. The system didn't yell. It didn't humiliate. It simply responded. That's what feels good. Not revenge, resolution. This is why stories like this spread. Not because people love seeing others punished, but because people are exhausted by watching bad behavior go unchecked. Most viewers have lived the opposite version. They've watched someone cut corners, abuse a role, speak down, and walk away untouched. That creates cognitive noise. It tells your brain the rules aren't real. That fairness is optional. So when a system finally says no, it soothes something deeper than anger. It restores predictability, and predictability is safety. That's why the pleasure is quiet. No one claps in the cabin, no one smiles. But the tension lifts. You don't feel excited, you feel settled. This matters because people misunderstand that reaction. They assume enjoying accountability makes you cruel. It doesn't, it makes you human. We don't crave punishment, we crave alignment. We want the world to behave the way it claims to. That effort shouldn't be met with dismissal. That power should come with limits. That silence shouldn't be the only survival strategy. When those expectations are violated repeatedly, people grow cynical. When they're restored even once, people share the story, not to brag, to remind themselves, no, this can still happen. There's another layer here. The pleasure is stronger when the correction is impersonal. Not a shouting match, not a viral confrontation. A system stepping in. Because systems feel bigger than individuals. They feel fairer. When accountability comes from structure, not emotion, it feels legitimate. Elaine wasn't defeated by an argument. She wasn't outmatched by rhetoric. She was reviewed, documented, counted. That's why it lands. The story doesn't say, look how bad she was. It says, look how small choices accumulate. That's more unsettling and more reassuring, because it means the outcome wasn't random. It was earned. Viewers don't walk away thinking, good, she got what she deserved. They walk away thinking, so that's where the line actually is. That's valuable, that's shareable. Because it gives language to a feeling people struggle to explain. Why did that feel good? Because something unresolved became resolved. Because power met a boundary. Because silence stopped being the safest option. This doesn't mean the world is fixed. It means it's still responsive. And responsiveness is enough to keep people believing. That belief is fragile. It needs reinforcement. Stories like this provide it, not through spectacle, through structure. That's why the satisfaction lingers. It's not adrenaline, it's reassurance. A reminder that while injustice can be quiet, accountability doesn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes all it takes is a system that notices. And when it does, people feel something rare. Not triumph, not revenge, order. And in a world where order feels increasingly optional, that feeling is powerful. That's why we watch. That's why we share. Not because we love seeing people fall, but because, for a moment, the world feels like it still has a spine. Real power rarely announces itself. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't rush to correct the room. It waits. People who rely on volume believe power is something you perform. People who actually have it know something else. Power is the ability to decide what happens next. Early in the story, everyone thought they knew who held it. The uniforms, the titles, the confident voices. They mistook permission for authority. They mistook access for control. Nadia never corrected them. She didn't explain. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to. Because real power doesn't argue in public. It documents in private. What shifted this story wasn't a reveal. It wasn't a speech. It was consequence. The kind that arrives quietly. The kind that doesn't ask for agreement. That's the difference between appearing powerful and being powerful. One depends on recognition, the other doesn't. People who speak early are often trying to secure something. Respect, compliance, safety. People who wait already have it. They're not passive, they're precise. They understand that timing matters more than volume. That proof matters more than outrage. That systems don't respond to feelings, they respond to records. This is why the most dangerous assumption in the room is thinking silence means weakness. Sometimes silence means you're being measured. Sometimes it means the situation is being logged. Sometimes it means the outcome is already moving through channels you don't have access to. By the time consequences show up, the moment for negotiation is long gone. No one was punished for making a mistake. They were held accountable for choices, repeated ones, conscious ones. That's an important distinction, because mistakes invite correction, choices invite consequence, and institutions, when they work, are built to tell the difference. This story isn't about winning an argument. It's about understanding leverage, about knowing that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one deciding the ending. And that control doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from preparation. Most people watching this won't ever be in a premier cabin, but they've been in rooms where someone decided they didn't belong. Where the rules felt flexible, where silence felt safer than speaking up. This story isn't telling you to stay quiet. It's telling you to be intentional, to know when to speak and when to gather. Because power used too early disappears. Power used at the right moment reshapes outcomes. So here's the question this story leaves behind. Not who was right, not who was wrong, but this. The next time you see someone being quietly tested, and nothing seems to be happening, do you assume nothing will, or do you recognize the moment before consequences arrive? Because the people who truly understand power are rarely the ones who need to say it out loud.